Welcome to a procurement podcast, The Reform Rundown, with your hosts Chris Robinson and Fleur Summers.
Over the course of this series, Fleur and I will be discussing some of the main themes and concepts surrounding the Procurement Act 2023 and what it will mean to the public sector ahead of launch. Fleur and I have a combined 40 years public sector procurement experience and will be using some of that experience to share our knowledge and insights around the Act itself.
So let's get into today's topic.
Welcome to episode 9 of the Procurement Podcast, the Reform Rundown. In this episode, we've finally got around to covering a listener's choice theme. This time around, Chris and I are covering framework agreements. Now, this is quite timely given both of which have had a guidance notice produced. And whilst we feel it's a bit ambitious to cover frameworks and dynamic markets, which is what we said we would do before, we are just going to cover frameworks in this episode and then pick up dynamic markets in the next one.
So, yeah, as you said there, Fleur, it's been a few weeks since our previous podcast with the fantastic Spencer Hill of iCosta Limited. And if you recall, of course, we discussed procurement maturity. And if you happen to have missed that one, as we do with all our podcasts, we encourage you to have a listen to that, as it's somewhat different, but topical nevertheless, on an area that, of course, is essential for any public procuring organisation as they get ready for go live.
So despite the gap in time since our last podcast episode, there hasn't really been too much news in terms of coming from the Cabinet Office in terms of the Procurement Act, but this is mainly due to Parliament being currently in recess. That said, we did, of course, have the King's Speech recently, which took place on the 17th of July. And whilst there were matters covered which will no doubt impact public sector procurement, none of which were directly related to the Act. We have, however, continued to receive a steady stream of guidance notes over the past few weeks.
Yeah, and in summary, that's it, isn't it, in terms of the general roundup. So, we might as well we've got a lot to talk about. So, yeah, let's get into the main part of this podcast, which, of course, as you said at the outset, Fleur, is frameworks.
Okay, so let's start with frameworks. As a public sector procurement, we are no strangers to the use of framework agreements. However, the Procurement Act has brought in some significant changes that we need to be mindful of going forward, and we will try and cover off some of those in this episode.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of those significant changes in particular is the much discussed open framework approach, which, of course, didn't exist under the current public contract regulations. And those of you that happen to have followed the journey of the Act way back from January 2021 through to today will know that the main driver behind this is to create greater flexibility and encourage innovative market solutions, ultimately in an attempt to ensure continual competitive environments within this approach.
So let's just go back to basics for a moment, Chris, and remind ourselves of what the recently released guidance note stated in that under the Act, a framework, or dare we say traditional framework agreement that we may all know, is defined as a contract between a contracting authority and one or more suppliers that provides for future awards of a contract by a contracting authority to the supplier or suppliers. But now we're going to have an open framework, which in our understanding is a scheme of frameworks that provides for the award of successive frameworks on substantially the same terms.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, Fleur, now we've had lots of conversations with the sector, you and I, in readiness for go live. And of course, Fleur, as you'll remember, definitely, one of the most common pieces of feedback that we've received is that the guidance notes can be a little heavy, in terms of content. To read through and the digest, and the same can be said for the guidance notes that have most recently been released around frameworks, of course, and dynamic markets, which we're covering off in episode 10. Yeah, there's a lot of reference to the pedant sections, subsections, etc. within those guidance notes, and I think we've got a lot to cover on today's podcast. And if we were to truly go into the weeds of it, we'd be hosting podcasts running into several hours. And for sure, nobody wants that.
No one wants that.
The guidance notes cover both, one, above, and secondly, below threshold procurements. And we intend to focus on the former of those two. So certainly, the equal to and above threshold procurement acquisitions.
So just picking up on that point, and I think the guidance documents detail or reminders that above threshold and not exempt is a public contract and is generally awarded following a competitive tendering procedure. And also that contracts awarded under framework are referred to in this guidance of call-off contracts, which we all know in terms of that terminology. And unless otherwise stated, call-off contracts means call-off contracts that are public contracts. So in most cases, a framework will not commit a contracting authority to enter into a call-off contract, but it is possible that some do. So nice little get out clause there.
Yeah, a little bit of a caveat there, isn't it? Yeah. So that I noted general change, and within the guidance notes in particular, of course, is that the Act provides that conditions of participation that can be applied as part of the process for award of a call-off contract and implies a term into every framework that a contracting authority is permitted to exclude a supplier that becomes an excluded or excludable supplier from participating in any selection process for the award of a call-off contract.
That's a big change, isn't it? And then, of course, we have to consider the fact that contracting authorities will have to publish a contract award notice following the award of a call-off contract, which they probably should have been doing anyway, as in terms of best practice under frameworks at the moment, but we can get onto a bit of that later.
Yeah, if we kind of like move on there and I think what we've just covered there and what we've just discussed, I think that's pretty much it in terms of both general changes overall and, of course, aligned to, shall we say, the traditional framework approach. So with that in mind, I think probably an ideal opportunity to move on to talk about open frameworks.
Yeah, let's move on to that. So apart from instances where there's only one supplier on the open framework, and you and me had a bit of a debate on this, didn't we, when we first started talking about it? But
we're still friends, right? Yeah.
Well, yeah. But an open framework must be reopened at least once in the first 3 years of its duration and at least every 5 years thereafter, and to last 8 years in total. So that gives us a steer in terms of the minimum parameters around the approach and timeframes for it.
Definitely, and we've already said, haven't we? We don't want to go into the weeds of this and the detail within the guidance notes. We really want to provide those key takeaways for our listeners and viewers to kind of have that more the focus, shall we say. But just to recap on what you've just said there, Fleur, this means that the first framework that can last for a maximum of 3 years, but subsequent frameworks can go on for a maximum of 5 years each. Again, we've read and digested and understood from not only the Act, but of course the subsequent guidance notes around this in particular. So that in mind, and then again, another way perhaps to look at it is that an open framework could be reopened annually for an 8-year period. And yeah, I mean, come on, absolutely. That sounds fantastic in terms of creating a competitive environment and encouraging continual, innovative, cutting edge market offerings from the suppliers. The challenge here, and for you and I that, have worked directly within the sector for a long, long time, will know this and appreciate this, is that, what type of singular public sector organisation has the time and the resources to manage and maintain such an approach, so on
an annual basis.
Absolutely. The abilities there, the capacity to do so is another matter, I would suggest.
And they've got to ensure that the successive frameworks do not overlap too. So I think it's like it has to state when it's going to end and then starting. I think how you actually manage and resource it and maintain it is going to be quite an area if they do look to get into it. So sticking with the theme of management and resources, it's noted that in instances where the procurement organisation states no limit on the number of suppliers that can be party to an open framework, the existing supplier can be appointed to the new framework based on, at its choice, a number of 3 different scenarios. So our understanding is that the supplier has previously been awarded a framework in the scheme, so there is no requirement for the supplier to submit a new tender if it does not wish to update its offer. So that's more like the first option, isn't it?
Yeah, Yeah, absolutely. You know, as you say, almost scenario one, if you will. And
Yeah.
that's interesting, you know, particularly because that counts as what we've just raised as a positive with regards to encouraging and creating a competitive environment, you know. So, yeah, you've got a little bit of a pause for thought and consideration around that. So, yeah, it's an interesting point there.
But I guess it is worth noting that the supplier in question has to have been party to the framework in existence immediately before the new framework being awarded. So, stating the obvious, if a supplier decides to go down this path, the procuring organisation doesn't reassess the earlier tender and the supplier simply remains on the open framework.
Absolutely. So that's, as you say, I think we're almost badging these up in our own way, but that's scenario one then. Yeah, we move on to scenario two, and this is a little bit more straightforward. So simply the reassessment of a tender relating to an earlier award. So, you know, I don't think there's any way that you can simplify it any more than as I've just mentioned there in terms of that second scenario. And then the third and final scenario, if you will, is that the assessment of a new tender relating to the new framework itself. So there you are, you know, in terms of options and scenarios there, 1 through to 3.
And I guess 3 is probably going to be the area where newer suppliers could join if they're sort of interested to get into it.
Definitely. No, I would agree with that. And yeah, just a reminder here that I think an opportune moment to say this. Then we said it wasn't going to be too heavy in terms of the details. So that's probably a good opportunity to then say we'll close this one out and close the loop by discussing where the framework does in fact limit the number of suppliers that can be party to the framework.
I guess we're still taking that from an existing supplier perspective.
Yes, yeah, definitely.
So I guess it's slightly different scenarios, I think, from our understanding of it, but an existing supplier can be appointed to the new framework based on, at its choice, either of the following. So scenario 1, as we're taking similar approach, following the reassessment of a tender relating to an earlier award, or scenario 2, following the assessment of a new tender relating to the new framework. You just don't have that very first scenario where they can just be appointed onto it because they haven't been on one before.
That's a little bit more black and white, isn't it, that one?
Yeah.
It's fairly easy to follow and understand. So, yeah, should we move on?
Yeah, let's move on. A single supplier open framework? Can we attempt that?
Okay then. Yeah, why not? Yeah. So this is, of course, an instance where only one supplier is awarded a framework, just kind of like remembering and reminding myself of our earlier conversation, Fleur. Let's not get into the whole debate of why would you just run an open tender in a situation such as this. Okay, yeah, here. The maximum term of the open framework is 4 years from the point at which the open framework becomes a single supplier framework, rather than the 8 years from the date of the first framework and when it's actually being awarded.
Just to sort of close the loop off on this remains the case even if more than one supplier is awarded a subsequent framework in a scheme. So it could be a situation or instance where the procuring organisation misunderstood the market.
Yeah, it could be. And again, the guidance notes themselves, you know, they go into much more detail in terms of the examples, scenarios, situations around how that might actually come to pass, you know. So, yeah, I think there's a lot of coverage around that within the guidance notes for sure.
There's a lot of learning here, isn't it? This is very new to everybody.
Yeah, definitely, 100%.
Okay, so the next area that we were going to talk around or tackle, shall we say, is call-off contracts and the approach here. So not too much has changed here, really, have they? These may be awarded with or without competition between suppliers on the framework. So a competitive selection process is used where contracting authorities carry out a competition for the award of a call-off contract, and the selection process for awarding call-off contracts must be set out in the framework narrative, which is very similar.
Yeah, definitely. And sticking with familiarity and similarities, then, you know, the theme of same old, the guidance notes make reference to the Oh dear, the taxi rank
Taxi rank.
system as a possible mechanism for supplier selection where call off contracts and appointments are awarded on a rotational basis. Yeah, so a familiar, tried and tested methodology and approach, I would suggest there.
And I think the other suggestion that they were talking around was also the highest ranking system, where a limitation is placed on a number of value of call-off contracts to be awarded to any one supplier. But again, it's an approach which could be quite resource heavy and time consuming to manage and oversee. So there's a lot of that appearing.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, just kind of build on that, and you kind of sort of think then in a scenario like that, what type of public sector procuring organisation would perhaps maybe look to adopt an approach like that? You probably, if we think local authorities, for example, probably a county or city council that perhaps maybe has a larger procurement resource, and perhaps maybe a contract management team, and they're closely working alongside the functional department that has that procurement need, and they've got a really clearly defined contract management process in place there as well, and defined dates on which they want to, obviously, the key dates around activities that would allow them to take the time and adopt this highest ranking system, a process call off, if you will. Definitely, yeah. So to wrap this up, there's a reference around best practice, and who better than yourself to comment on this? I know you love a bit of best practice, don't you?
I do, and I knew you were going to say that. So yeah, in terms of best practice, so whilst assessment summaries, or as what we currently call them, outcome letters at the moment, are not required to be provided to suppliers following the award of a call-off contract, procuring organisations are encouraged to provide them as a matter of best practice.
Definitely, and it's often forgotten, isn't it, as well, that those feedback letters, even in instances where the act as will be, and the public contract regulations currently, they don't mandate that, but I would suggest from a supplier perspective, and almost kind of growing the skills and capabilities of the supplier base, feedback's important for them to actually determine why, in fact, on that particular scenario, that particular procurement exercise, they have fallen short. I think sometimes the sector are somewhat fearful of doing that because they think, oh, goodness me, I don't want to invite any, unwanted requests for further information, or perhaps maybe difficult conversations with unsuccessful suppliers. But if you turn it on its head and you look at it from a different perspective, providing that detail by way of best practice, Fleur, educates the supplier. It gives them a little bit more steer in terms of exactly what that public procuring organisation wanted and their anticipations around the requirement that is being delivered under the contract once it is awarded, and puts them in a much stronger, more educated, more knowledgeable position next time that opportunity comes up in the future, whether that be at that same public sector procuring organisation or elsewhere. So I think it has real value to them, doesn't it? And whilst at the same time, it grows the capabilities and understandings around public sector procurement requirements, definitely.
And I know it's something that I've always done in terms of call-offs, in terms of best practice, and doing that sort of and doing award letters and those type of things. So it's good to see it in there. As still a suggestion is that we should be following that.
Sure. Okay, so let's finish off with a quick acknowledgement around the notices. I say a quick acknowledgement. There's quite a lot to go through here, and for those of you that have happened at the time of the release of this recording, and whenever it is that you're listening to this particular podcast itself, if you have already started to read and digest the narrative in the guidance notes, you'll know exactly what we're referring to here when we say that there is a lot of detail to read and get your heads around. And the same applies here with the references around frameworks in relation to notices themselves. And we've talked about the notices, of course, in previous episodes. In fact, correct me if I'm wrong, I think we may have even actually produced some material within the blog post around notices as well. So, we've covered that off there too. But given they're so detailed within the guidance notes for frameworks, we might as well cover them, wouldn't you say?
We'll give it a try. Let's give it a try. Okay, so if we think about pipeline notice, so a pipeline notice is required if an organisation believes it will commit more than £100 million via procurement activity. And one of the points that is here is when calculating whether an organisation will exceed the 100 million, the calculation must include all payments that will be made under existing and future contracts. Whilst the framework is a contract, the value of the framework itself is not taken into account.
Yeah, definitely. And this is because payments will not be made under the framework, but instead will be made under each relevant or separate contract awarded under the framework itself. Okay. I know, again, when you and I were reading through the guidance notes, we made some scribbles and notes, and we always had to reread that several times, didn't we, to say, okay, then what does this mean in real terms? And to clarify, in terms of the acts where a contracting authority is required to publish a by notice, in instances that you've referred to right at the top of when we started off talking about this particular approach, is that there is no requirement to include planned future awards of frameworks in the notice. And when you stop and think about that, that's common sense, right? Yeah. Why would you? So, yeah.
But as we know, visibility is key to all notices, not just the pipeline notice. However, a lead procuring organisation that is planning to establish a framework for use by other contracting authorities.
Yeah, so basically then, as we've interpreted and understood it, then it's a lead on a consortium or joint procurement arrangement, right?
Yeah, so in that case, in the instance, if it's varied over 2 million, the lead organisation, if you want to think of them that way, should include the framework on its pipeline notice in order to provide earlier visibility to the market.
Sure, and that's from what we've seen there and what we've read, and we've digested the content of the guidance notes. The main takeaways, the main points in relation to pipeline notices and thinking about frameworks, of course. Okay, Chris, sharp intake of breath. Tender notices. There's quite a bit to go through here, from a framework perspective. So tender notices.
Good luck.
I've pulled the short straw with this one, I feel. But okay, a few points here to go through. In fact, no less than 4 in fact then. So firstly, must contain details of the selection process to be applied on the award of the call-off contracts. And secondly, the duration of the framework and the reasons, where necessary, where relevant, for awarding a framework with a term exceeding 4 or 8 years. Third element here is the identification of all contracting authorities that may award call-off contracts under the framework during its term, which I would suggest, and I think, Fleur, you would agree, is nothing new.
It's nothing new, no.
This can be, exactly. This can be done either by listing the names of those authorities, or perhaps, and this is a nice little catch-all, or perhaps by stating all central government authorities as defined in the Procurement Act 2023. If you think about large consortium and framework providers, I would say that this will fit well, and an approach that will probably be adopted by the likes of Crown Commercial Services for their frameworks, which by and large, they tend to make available for all public sector, UK public sector procuring organisations. And then the fourth area I'd suggest consideration here is where the contracting authority intends to award the framework to a single supplier, maximum number of suppliers, or in fact an unlimited number of suppliers. Okay, take over, Fleur. Sticking with tender notices.
Now I've got another 3. Okay. Okay. So you also have to detail whether a framework provides for the charging of fees, and if so, the fixed percentage of the estimated value of any contract awarded to the supplier in accordance with the framework, along with any other information explaining how fees will be charged. So in these tender notices, again, they get quite detailed, aren't they, if you're putting all of this information in there. In addition, has to state whether the framework to be established is an open framework, and if so, the estimated end date of the open framework, which again is nothing new.
Sure.
And finally, where the framework is awarded under an open framework, the unique identifier used in the procurement of the previous framework in the scheme. I think that's how it's being called. So I guess that's so you can show that there's successive framework agreements.
Definitely. And smiling to myself here, and we talked about best practice approaches here, and I'm thinking about how these notices will transpire and how they'll be presented on the plethora of e-procurement platforms that are available. And of course, I know those providers are working hard at this moment in time to get the notices in such a way that users of these e-procurement platforms are able to use those and compile their notices accordingly, as they do under the existing format through those platforms themselves. And what I was just thinking there as you were reading through those particular points and making notes of those is that with the platform itself, the amount of areas there that are now going to be defined as mandatory must be completed.
There's going to be more.
Absolutely. And it lends itself well to the point that you just made there in terms of how big are these notices going to actually be in terms of content, and we say it in jest, but there's a degree of seriousness around this, is the amount of resource and time that's going to be required in which to actually, I would suggest, first of all, plan what you're going to put in those notices and then start completing them for sure. For sure.
Sign off on it's going to be it's going to be quite a lot.
Definitely. So I'm sure our listeners, as well as you and I, are glad that covers off tender notices. So a real quick note again, pun intended, on the transparency notice then. So as advised previously, generally used in place of a tender notice if a contracting authority intends to directly award a framework, bearing in mind that this is not relevant for open frameworks as they cannot be directly awarded. The additional information required to be included in a transparency notice for the award of a framework is as follows. So 3 main points here I would suggest then. So first of all, the term of the framework, okay, obvious, straightforward, no issues with that. Secondly, whether the framework will allow for fees to be charged to a supplier in accordance with the framework as previously referenced. And I think that lends itself well to one of the other notices that we've covered. Yeah, for sure. And then finally, the contracting authority is entitled to award contracts in accordance with the framework, whether that be by listing the names of those authorities or by describing categories of authorities.
Okay, and so to wrap things up in terms of the notices, because there's quite a lot, but in terms of frameworks and notices related, the contract details notice is obviously required following the award of a framework. So the framework guidance note stresses the amount of information that will be required as mandatory, none of which should be a surprise or in fact challenging to provide for procuring bodies. However, one significant change is that the contract award notice, and I think we just mentioned that earlier on, is required for all call-off contracts except for defence and security contracts awarded under a defence and security framework and direct award.
Okay, so and just building on that then, the information required for contract award notices published by private utilities again differ slightly from those required for other public sector bodies. And one last thing actually, and sorry, probably worth a mention, assessment summaries, or do we refer to them as outcome letters for the award of call-off contract that is not done via a competitive tendering procedure for the direct award of a contract or even for the award of a contract. Guidance notes confirming this scenario, neither the summaries themselves or observing the mandatory standstill period do not apply. But it lends itself well, Fleur, to what you were discussing earlier around best practice. Absolutely. It is encouraged for procuring organisations to provide assessment summaries and implement a voluntary standstill period with the view to demonstrating best practice.
Oh, that was a lot in terms of notices. And I think that's probably it in terms of frameworks and the key areas. I think that's been a really useful discussion, just some of the key changes, don't you think? Open frameworks is going to be interesting to see how they get utilised, how they work going forwards.
Yeah, I think so. And I would suggest, in terms of the amount of detail that we've covered here on this particular podcast, and, of course, what we've got planned for the Dynamics podcast as well, Dynamic Markets, it's going to be more of the same, isn't it? I think actually this particular podcast and the one to follow again on Dynamic Markets is probably, it's a little bit more, dare I say, black and white, isn't it? It's a bit more factual. It's a little less opinion based, because, of course, this is really important that the sector get to grips with this and get this right from the outset. So I think this is why, this is why it's so important. And there's the window for go live is becoming smaller
it's getting closer and closer,
isn't it? And it's getting closer and closer, definitely. So whilst we're in this summer period, I think is an ideal opportunity to get swatting up on not only frameworks and dynamic markets as well, for sure.
So, as we mentioned, I think that's the end of this podcast in terms of framework agreements. Please keep an eye out on our LinkedIn page and join our group for any further updates between now and episode 10, where we will, of course, be covering dynamic markets, as we have promised very much over the past few episodes. And then I think from our discussions, we've got quite a few exciting topics that we're looking forward to doing, aren't we?
Something a little bit different,
Something a little bit different. So keep an eye out. Definitely keep an eye out, and check out our new episodes when they go live. So speak to you all soon. Thank you.
Bye for now.